The Shambler from the Stars by Robert Bloch. I am what I profess to be, a writer of weird fiction. Since earliest childhood, I have been enthralled by the cryptic fascination of the unknown and the unguessable. The nameless fears, the grotesque dreams, the queer, half-intuitive fancies that haunt our minds have always exercised for me a potent and inexplicable delight. In literature, I have walked the midnight paths with Poe, or crept amidst the shadows with Machen, combed the realms of horrific stars with Baudelaire, or steeped myself with Earth's inner madness amidst the tales of ancient lore. A meager talent for sketching and crayon work led me to attempt crude picturizations involving the outlandish denizens of my nighted thoughts. The same somber trend of intellect which drew me in my art interested me in obscure realms of musical composition. The symphonic strains of the Planet's Suite and the like were my favorites. My inner life soon became a ghoulish feast of eldritch, tantalizing horrors. My outer existence was comparatively dull. As time went on, I found myself drifting more and more into the life of a penurious recluse, a tranquil, philosophical existence amidst a world of books and dreams. A man must live. By nature constitutionally and spiritually unfitted for manual labor, I was at first puzzled about the choice of a suitable vocation. The depression complicated matters to an almost intolerable degree, and for a time I was close to utter economic disaster. It was then that I decided to write. I procured a battered typewriter, a ream of cheap paper, and a few carbons. My subject matter did not bother me. What better field than the boundless realms of a colorful imagination? I would write of horror, fear, and the riddle that is death. At least, in the callowness of my unsophistication, this was my intention. My first attempts soon convinced me how utterly I had failed. Sadly, miserably, I fell short of my aspired goal. My vivid dreams became on paper merely meaningless jumbles of ponderous adjectives, and I found no ordinary words to express the wondrous terror of the unknown. My first manuscripts were miserable and futile documents, the few magazines using such material being unanimous in their rejections. I had to live. Slowly but surely I began to adjust my style to my ideas. Laboriously I experimented with words, phrases, sentence, structure. It was work, and hard work at that. I soon learned to sweat. At last, however, one of my stories met with favor, then a second, a third, a fourth. Soon I had begun to master the more obvious tricks of the trade, and the future looked brighter at last. It was with an easier mind that I returned to my dream life and my beloved books. My stories afforded me a somewhat meager livelihood, and for a time this sufficed, but not for long. Ambition, ever an illusion, was the cause of my undoing. I wanted to write a real story, not the stereotyped, ephemeral sort of tale I turned out for the magazines, but a real work of art. The creation of such a masterpiece became my ideal. I was not a good writer, but that was not entirely due to my errors in mechanical style. It was, I felt, the fault of my subject matter. Vampires, werewolves, ghouls, mythological monsters. These things constituted material of little merit. Commonplace imagery, ordinary adjectival treatment, and a prosaically anthropocentric point of view were the chief detriments to the production of a really good weird tale. I must have new subject matter, truly unusual plot material. If only I could conceive of something that was teratologically incredible. I longed to learn the songs the demons sing as they swoop between the stars, or hear the voices of the olden gods as they whisper their secrets to the echoing void. I yearned to know the terrors of the grave, the kiss of maggots on my tongue, the cold caress of a rotting shroud upon my body. I thirsted for the knowledge that lies in the pits of mummied eyes, and burned for wisdom known only to the worm. Then I could really write, and my hopes be truly realized. I sought a way. Quietly I began a correspondence with isolated thinkers and dreamers all over the country. There was a hermit in the western hills, a savant in the northern wilds, a mystic dreamer in New England. It was from the latter that I learned of the ancient books that hold strange lore. He quoted guardedly from the legendary Necronomicon, and spoke timidly of a certain book of Ibon that was reputed to surpass it in the utter wildness of its blasphemy. He himself had been a student of these volumes of primal dread, but he did not want me to search too far. He had heard many strange things as a boy in witch-haunted Arkham, where the old shadows still leer and creep, and since then he had wisely shunned the blacker knowledge of the forbidden. At length, after much pressing on my part, he reluctantly consented to furnish me with the names of certain persons he deemed able to aid me in my quest. He was a writer of notable brilliance and wide reputation among the discriminating few, and I knew he was keenly interested in the outcome of the whole affair. As soon as his precious list came into my possession, I began a widespread postal campaign in order to obtain access to the desired volumes. My letters went out to universities, private libraries, reputed seers, and the leaders of carefully hidden and obscurely designated cults. But I was foredoomed to disappointment. The replies I received were definitely unfriendly, almost hostile. Evidently the rumored possessors of such lore were angered that their secret should be thus unveiled by a prying stranger. I was subsequently the recipient of several anonymous threats through the mails, and I had one very alarming phone call. This did not bother me nearly so much as the disappointing realization that my endeavors had failed. Denials, evasions, refusals, threats, these would not aid me. I must look elsewhere. The bookstores. Perhaps on some musty and forgotten shelf I might discover what I sought. Then I began an interminable crusade. I learned to bear my numerous disappointments with unflinching calm. Nobody in the common run of shops seemed ever to have heard of the frightful Necronomicon, the evil book of Ebon, or the disquieting Cultes des Goules. Persistence brings results. In a little old shop on South Dearborn Street, amidst dusty shelves, seemingly forgotten by time, I came to the end of my search. There, securely wedged between two century-old editions of Shakespeare, stood a great black volume with iron facings. Upon it, in hand-engraved lettering, was the inscription, De Vermis Mysteriis, or Mysteries of the Worm. The proprietor could not tell how it had come into his possession. Years before, perhaps, it had been included in some second-hand job lot. He was obviously unaware of its nature, for I purchased it with $1 bill. He wrapped the ponderous thing for me, well pleased at this unexpected sale, and bade me a very satisfied good day. I left hurriedly, the precious prize under my arm. What a find! I had heard of this book before. Ludwig Prynne was its author, who had perished at the inquisitorial stake in Brussels when the witchcraft trials were at their height. A strange character, alchemist, necromancer, reputed mage, he boasted of having attained a miraculous age when he at last suffered a fiery immolation at the hands of the secular arm. He was said to have proclaimed himself the sole survivor of the ill-fated Ninth Crusade, exhibiting as proof certain musty documents of attestation. It is true that a certain Ludwig Prynne was numbered among the gentlemen retainers of Montserrat in the olden chronicles, but the incredulous branded Ludwig as a crack-brained impostor, though perchance a lineal descendant of the original warrior. Ludwig attributed his sorcerous learning to the years he had spent as a captive among the wizards and wonder-workers of Syria, and glibly he spoke of encounters with the jinns and ifrits of elder Eastern myth. He is known to have spent some time in Egypt, and there are legends among the Libyan dervishes concerning the old seer's deeds in Alexandria. At any rate, his declining days were spent in the Flemish lowland country of his birth, where he resided, appropriately enough, in the ruins of a pre-Roman tomb that stood in the forest near Brussels. Ludwig was reputed to have dwelt there amidst a swarm of familiars and fearsomely invoked conjurations. Manuscripts still extant speak of him guardedly as being attended by invisible companions and star-sent servants. Peasants shunned the forest by night, for they did not like certain noises that resounded to the moon, and they most certainly were not anxious to see what worshipped at the old pagan altars that stood crumbling in certain of the darker glens. Be that as it may, these creatures that he commanded were never seen after Prynne's capture by the inquisitorial minions. Searching soldiers found the tomb entirely deserted, though it was thoroughly ransacked before its destruction. The supernatural entities, the unusual instruments and compounds, all had most curiously vanished. A search of the forbidding woods and a timorous examination of the strange altars did not add to the information. There were fresh bloodstains on the altars, and fresh bloodstains on the rack too, before the questioning of Prynne was finished. A series of particularly atrocious tortures failed to elicit any further disclosures from the silent wizard, and at length the weary interrogators ceased and cast the aged sorcerer into a dungeon. It was in prison, while awaiting trial, that he penned the morbid, horror-hinting lines of De Vermis Mysteriis, known today as Mysteries of the Worm. How it was ever smuggled through the alert guards is a mystery in itself. But a year after his death it saw print in Cologne. It was immediately suppressed, but a few copies had already been privately distributed. These in turn were transcribed, and although there was a later censored and deleted printing, only the Latin original is accepted as genuine. Throughout the centuries, a few of the elect have read and pondered on its lore. The secrets of the old archimage are known today only to the initiated, and they discourage all attempts to spread their fame for certain very definite reasons. This, in brief, was what I knew of the volume's history at the time it came into my possession. As a collector's item alone, the book was a phenomenal find, but on its contents I could pass no judgment. It was in Latin. Since I can speak or translate only a few words of that learned tongue, I was confronted by a barrier as soon as I opened the musty pages. It was maddening to have such a treasure trove of dark knowledge at my command, and yet lack the key to its unearthing. For a moment I despaired, since I was unwilling to approach any local classical or Latin scholar in connection with so hideous and blasphemous a text. Then came an inspiration. Why not take it east and seek the aid of my friend? He was a student of the classics, and would be less likely to be shocked by the horrors of Prynne's baleful revelations. Accordingly, I addressed a hasty letter to him, and shortly thereafter received my reply. He would be glad to assist me. I must by all means come at once. Providence is a lovely town. My friend's house was ancient and quaintly Georgian. The first floor was a gem of colonial atmosphere. The second, beneath antique gables that shadowed the enormous window, served as a workroom for my host. It was here that we pondered that grim, eventful night last April, here beside the open window that overlooked the azure sea. It was a moonless night, haggard and wan, with a fog that filled the darkness with bat-like shadows. In my mind's eye I can see it still, the tiny lamplit room with the big table and the high-backed chairs, the bookcases bordering the walls, the manuscripts stacked in special files. My friend and I sat at the table, the volume of mystery before us. His lean profile threw a disturbing shadow on the wall, and his waxen face was furtive in the pale light. There was an inexplicable air of portentous revelation quite disturbing in its potency. I sensed the presence of secrets waiting to be revealed. My companion detected it too. Long years of occult experience had sharpened his intuition to an uncanny degree. It was not cold that made him tremble as he sat there in his chair. It was not fever that caused his eyes to flame like jewel-incarned fires. He knew, even before he opened that accursed tome, that it was evil. The musty scent that rose from those antique pages carried with it the reek of the tomb. The faded leaves were maggoty at the edges, and rats had gnawed the leather, rats which perchance had a ghastlier food for common fare. I had told my friend the volume's history that afternoon, and had unwrapped it in his presence. Then he had seemed willing and eager to begin an immediate translation. Now he demurred. It was not wise, he insisted. This was evil knowledge. Who could say what demon-dreaded lore these pages might contain, or what ills befall the ignorant one who sought to tamper with their contents? It is not good to learn too much, and men had died for exercising the rotted wisdom that these leaves contained. He begged me to abandon the quest while the book was still unopened, and to seek my inspiration in saner things. I was a fool. Hastily I overruled his objections with vain and empty words. I was not afraid. Let us at least gaze into the contents of our prize. I began to turn the pages. The result was disappointing. It was an ordinary-looking volume after all. Yellow, crumbling leaves, set with heavy black-lettered Latin texts. That was all. No illustrations, no alarming designs. My friend could no longer resist the allurement of such a rare bibliophilic treat. In a moment he was peering intently over my shoulder, occasionally muttering snatches of Latin phrasing. Enthusiasm mastered him at last. Seizing the precious tome in both hands, he seated himself near the window and began reading paragraphs at random, occasionally translating them into English. His eyes gleamed with a feral light. His cadaverous profile grew intent as he pored over the mouldering runes. Sentences thundered in fearsome litany, then faded into tones below a whisper as his voice became as soft as a viper's hiss. I caught only a few phrases now, for in his introspection he seemed to have forgotten me. He was reading of spells and enchantments. I recall allusions to such gods of divination as Father Yig, Dark Han, and serpent-bearded Byatis. I shuddered, for I knew these names of old, but I would have shuddered more had I known what was yet to come. It came quickly. Suddenly he turned to me in great agitation, and his excited voice was shrill. He asked me if I remembered the legends of Prin's sorcery and the tales of the invisible servants he commanded from the stars. I assented, little understanding the cause of his sudden frenzy. Then he told me the reason. Here, under a chapter on familiars, he had found an orison or spell, perhaps the very one Prin had used to call upon his unseen servitors from beyond the stars. Let me listen while he read. I sat there dully, like a stupid, uncomprehending fool. Why did I not scream, try to escape, or tear that monstrous manuscript from his hands? Instead, I sat there while my friend, in a voice cracked with unnatural excitement, read in Latin a long and sonorously sinister invocation. Tibi, magnum innominandum, signa stellarum nigrarum et buffoniformis sadoque sigillum. The croaking ritual proceeded, then rose on wings of nighted, hideous horror. The words seemed to writhe like flames in the air, burning into my brain. The thundering tones cast an echo into infinity, beyond the farthermost star. They seemed to pass into primal and undimensioned gates, to seek out a listener there and summon him to earth. Was it all an illusion? I did not pause to ponder, for that unwitting summons was answered. Scarcely had my companion's voice died away in that little room before the terror came. The room turned cold. A sudden wind shrieked in through the open window, a wind that was not of earth. It bore an evil bleating from afar, and at the sound my friend's face became a pale white mask of newly awakened fear. Then there was a crunching at the walls, and the window ledge buckled before my staring eyes. From out of the nothingness beyond that opening came a sudden burst of lubricious laughter, a hysterical cackling born of utter madness. It rose to the grinning quintessence of all horror, without mouth to give it birth. The rest happened with startling swiftness. All at once my friend began to scream as he stood by the window, scream and claw wildly at empty air. In the lamplight I saw his features contort into a grimace of insane agony. A moment later, his body rose unsupported from the floor and began to bend outward to a back-breaking degree. A second later came the sickening grind of broken bones. His form now hung in mid-air, the eyes glazed and the hands clutching convulsively as if at something unseen. Once again, there came the sound of maniacal tittering, but this time it came from within the room. The stars rocked in red anguish. The cold wind gibbered in my ears. I crouched in my chair, my eyes riveted on that astounding scene in the corner. My friend was shrieking now. His screams blended with that gleeful, atrocious laughter from the empty air. His sagging body, dangling in space, bent backward once again as blood spurted from the torn neck, spraying like a ruby fountain. That blood never reached the floor. It stopped in mid-air as the laughter ceased, and a loathsome sucking noise took its place. With a new and accelerated horror, I realized that blood was being drained to feed the invisible entity from beyond. What creature of space had been so suddenly and unwittingly invoked? What was that vampiric monstrosity I could not see? Even now a hideous metamorphosis was taking place. The body of my companion became shrunken, wizened, lifeless. At length it dropped to the floor and lay nauseatingly still. But in mid-air another and a ghastlier change occurred. A reddish glow filled the corner by the window, a bloody glow. Slowly but surely the dim outlines of a presence came into view, the blood-filled outlines of that unseen Shambler from the stars. It was red and dripping, an immensity of pulsing, moving jelly, a scarlet blob with myriad tentacular trunks that waved and waved. There were suckers on the tips of the appendages, and these were opening and closing with a ghoulish lust. The thing was bloated and obscene, a headless, faceless, eyeless bulk, with the ravenous maw and titanic talons of a starborn monster. The human blood on which it had fed revealed the hitherto invisible outlines of the feaster. It was not a sight for sane eyes to see. Fortunately for my reason, the creature did not linger. Spurning the dead and flabby corpse-like thing on the floor, it purposely seized the opening. There it disappeared, and I heard its far-off, derisive laughter floating on the wings of the wind as it receded into the gulfs from whence it had come. That was all. I was left alone in the room with the limp and lifeless body at my feet. The book was gone, but there were bloody prints upon the wall, bloody swaths upon the floor, and the face of my poor friend was a bloody death's head, leering up at the stars. For a long time I sat alone in silence before I set to fire that room and all it contained. After that I went away, laughing, for I knew that the blaze would eradicate all trace of what remained. I had arrived only that afternoon, and there was none who knew, and none to see me go, for I departed ere the glowing flames were detected. I stumbled for hours through the twisted streets and quaked with renewed and idiotic laughter as I looked up at the burning, ever-gloating stars that eyed me furtively through wreaths of haunted fog. After a long while, I became calm enough to board a train. I have been calm throughout the long journey home, and calm throughout the penning of this screed. I was even calm when I read of my friend's curious accidental death in the fire that destroyed his dwelling. It is only at nights, when the stars gleam, that dreams return to drive me into a gigantic maze of frantic fears. Then I take to drugs, in a vain attempt to ban those leering memories from my sleep. But I really do not care, for I shall not be here long. I have a curious suspicion that I shall again see that Shambler from the stars. I think it will return soon without being resummoned, and I know that when it comes, it will seek me out and carry me down into the darkness that holds my friend. Sometimes I almost yearn for the advent of that day, for then I shall learn once and for all the mysteries of the worm.
The Haunter of the Dark by H.P. Lovecraft. Dedicated to Robert Bloch. I have seen the dark universe yawning where the black planets roll without aim, where they roll in their horror unheeded, without knowledge or luster or name. Nemesis. Cautious investigators will hesitate to challenge the common belief that Robert Blake was killed by lightning, or by some profound nervous shock derived from an electrical discharge. It is true that the window he faced was unbroken, but nature has shown herself capable of many freakish performances. The expression on his face may easily have arisen from some obscure muscular source unrelated to anything he saw, while the entries in his diary are clearly the result of a fantastic imagination aroused by certain local superstitions and by certain old matters he had uncovered. As for the anomalous conditions at the deserted church on Federal Hill, the shrewd analyst is not slow in attributing them to some charlatanry, conscious or unconscious, with at least some of which Blake was secretly connected. For after all, the victim was a writer and painter, wholly devoted to the field of myth, dream, terror, and superstition, and avid in his quest for scenes and effects of a bizarre spectral sort. His earlier stay in the city, a visit to a strange old man as deeply given to occult and forbidden lore as he, had ended amidst death and flame, and it must have been some morbid instinct which drew him back from his home in Milwaukee. He may have known of the old stories despite his statements to the contrary in the diary, and his death may have nipped in the bud some stupendous hoax destined to have a literary reflection. Among those, however, who have examined and correlated all this evidence, there remain several who cling to less rational and commonplace theories. They are inclined to take much of Blake's diary at its face value, and point significantly to certain facts such as the undoubted genuineness of the old church record, the verified existence of the disliked and unorthodox Starry Wisdom sect prior to 1877, the recorded disappearance of an inquisitive reporter named Edwin M. Lillibridge in 1893, and, above all, the look of monstrous, transfiguring fear on the face of the young writer when he died. It was one of these believers who, moved to fanatical extremes, threw into the bay the curiously angled stone and its strangely adorned metal box found in the old church steeple, the black windowless steeple, and not the tower where Blake's diary said those things originally were. Though widely censured both officially and unofficially, this man, a reputable physician with a taste for odd folklore, averred that he had rid the earth of something too dangerous to rest upon it. Between these two schools of opinion, the reader must judge for himself. The papers have given the tangible details from a skeptical angle, leaving for others the drawing of the picture as Robert Blake saw it, or thought he saw it, or pretended to see it. Now, studying the diary closely, dispassionately, and at leisure, let us summarize the dark chain of events from the expressed point of view of their chief actor. Young Blake returned to Providence in the winter of 1934, taking the upper floor of a venerable dwelling in a grassy court off College Street, on the crest of the great eastward hill near the Brown University campus and behind the marble John Hay Library. It was a cozy and fascinating place, in a little garden oasis of village-like antiquity where huge, friendly cats sunned themselves atop a convenient shed. The square Georgian house had a monitor roof, classic doorway with fan carving, small paned windows, and all the other earmarks of early 19th century workmanship. Inside were 6-panelled doors, wide floorboards, a curving colonial staircase, white Adam period mantels, and a rear set of rooms 3 steps below the general level. Blake's study, a large southwest chamber, overlooked the front garden on one side, while its west windows, before one of which he had his desk, faced off from the brow of the hill and commanded a splendid view of the lower town's outspread roofs and of the mystical sunsets that flamed behind them. On the far horizon were the open countryside's purple slopes. Against these, some 2 miles away, rose the spectral hump of Federal Hill, bristling with huddled roofs and steeples whose remote outlines wavered mysteriously, taking fantastic forms as the smoke of the city swirled up and enmeshed them. Blake had a curious sense that he was looking upon some unknown ethereal world which might or might not vanish in dream if ever he tried to seek it out and enter it in person. Having sent home for most of his books, Blake bought some antique furniture suitable to his quarters and settled down to write and paint, living alone and attending to the simple housework himself. His studio was in a north attic room, where the panes of the monitor roof furnished admirable lighting. During that first winter he produced 5 of his best-known short stories: The Burrower Beneath, The Stairs in the Crypt, Shagai, In the Vale of Penath, and The Feaster from the Stars, and painted 7 canvases. Studies of nameless unhuman monsters and profoundly alien non-terrestrial landscapes. At sunset he would often sit at his desk and gaze dreamily off at the outspread west, the dark towers of Memorial Hall just below, the Georgian courthouse belfry, the lofty pinnacles of the downtown section, and that shimmering, spire-crowned mound in the distance, whose unknown streets and labyrinthine gables so potently provoked his fancy. From his few local acquaintances, he learned that the far-off slope was a vast Italian quarter, though most of the houses were remnants of older Yankee and Irish days. Now and then he would train his field glasses on that spectral, unreachable world beyond the curling smoke, picking out individual roofs and chimneys and steeples, and speculating upon the bizarre and curious mysteries they might house. Even with optical aid, Federal Hill seemed somehow alien, half-fabulous, and linked to the unreal, intangible marvels of Blake's own tales and pictures. The feeling would persist long after the hill had faded into the violet, lamp-starred twilight, and the courthouse floodlights and the red Industrial Trust beacon had blazed up to make the night grotesque. Of all the distant objects on Federal Hill, a certain huge dark church most fascinated Blake. It stood out with a special distinctness at certain hours of the day, and at sunset the great tower and tapering steeple loomed blackly against the flaming sky. It seemed to rest on especially high ground, for the grimy facade and the obliquely seen north side with sloping roof and the tops of great pointed windows rose boldly above the tangle of surrounding ridgepoles and chimney pots. Peculiarly grim and austere, it appeared to be built of stone, stained and weathered with the smoke and storms of a century and more. The style, so far as the glass could show, was that earliest experimental form of Gothic revival, which preceded the stately Upjohn period and held over some of the outlines and proportions of the Georgian age. Perhaps it was reared around 1810 or 1815. As months passed, Blake watched the far-off, forbidding structure with an oddly mounting interest. Since the vast windows were never lighted, he knew that it must be vacant. The longer he watched, the more his imagination worked, till at length he began to fancy curious things. He believed that a vague, singular aura of desolation hovered over the place, so that even the pigeons and swallows shunned its smoky eaves. Around other towers and belfries, his glass would reveal great flocks of birds, but here they never rested. At least, that is what he thought and set down in his diary. He pointed the place out to several friends, but none of them had even been on Federal Hill or possessed the faintest notion of what the church was or had been. In the spring, a deep restlessness gripped Blake. He had begun his long-planned novel, based on a supposed survival of the witch cult in Maine, but was strangely unable to make progress with it. More and more he would sit at his westward window and gaze at the distant hill and the black, frowning steeple shunned by the birds. When the delicate leaves came out on the garden boughs, the world was filled with a new beauty, but Blake's restlessness was merely increased. It was then that he first thought of crossing the city and climbing bodily up that fabulous slope into the smoke-wreathed world of dream. Late in April, just before the eon-shadowed Walpurgis time, Blake made his first trip into the unknown. Plodding through the endless downtown streets and the bleak, decayed squares beyond, he came finally upon the ascending avenue of century-worn steps, sagging Doric porches, and blear-paned cupolas, which he felt must lead up to the long-known unreachable world beyond the mists. There were dingy blue and white street signs which meant nothing to him, and presently he noted the strange, dark faces of the drifting crowds and the foreign signs over curious shops in brown, decade-weathered buildings. Nowhere could he find any of the objects he had seen from afar, so that once more he half fancied that the Federal Hill of that distant view was a dream world never to be trod by living human feet. Now and then a battered church facade or crumbling spire came in sight, but never the blackened pile that he sought. When he asked a shopkeeper about a great stone church, the man smiled and shook his head, though he spoke English freely. As Blake climbed higher, the region seemed stranger and stranger, with bewildering mazes of brooding brown alleys leading eternally off to the south. He crossed 2 or 3 broad avenues, and once thought he glimpsed a familiar tower. Again he asked a merchant about the massive church of stone, and this time he could have sworn that the plea of ignorance was feigned. The dark man's face had a look of fear which he tried to hide, and Blake saw him make a curious sign with his right hand. Then suddenly, a black spire stood out against the cloudy sky on his left, above the tiers of brown roofs lining the tangled southerly alleys. Blake knew at once what it was, and plunged toward it through the squalid, unpaved lanes that climbed from the avenue. Twice he lost his way, but he somehow dared not ask any of the patriarchs or housewives who sat on their doorsteps, or any of the children who shouted and played in the mud of the shadowy lanes. At last, he saw the tower plain against the southwest, and a huge stone bulk rose darkly at the end of an alley. Presently he stood in a wind-swept open square, quaintly cobblestoned, with a high bank wall on the farther side. This was the end of his quest, for upon the wide, iron-railed, weed-grown plateau which the wall supported, a separate, lesser world raised fully 6 feet above the surrounding streets, there stood a grim Titan bulk whose identity, despite Blake's new perspective, was beyond dispute. The vacant church was in a state of great decrepitude. Some of the high stone buttresses had fallen, and several delicate finials lay half lost among the brown, neglected weeds and grasses. The sooty Gothic windows were largely unbroken, though many of the stone mullions were missing. Blake wondered how the obscurely painted panes could have survived so well, in view of the known habits of small boys the world over. The massive doors were intact and tightly closed. Around the top of the bank wall, fully enclosing the grounds, was a rusty iron fence whose gate, at the head of a flight of steps from the square, was visibly padlocked. The path from the gate to the building was completely overgrown. Desolation and decay hung like a pall above the place, and in the birdless eaves and black, ivyless walls, Blake felt a touch of the dimly sinister beyond his power to define. There were very few people in the square, but Blake saw a policeman at the northerly end and approached him with questions about the church. He was a great, wholesome Irishman, and it seemed odd that he would do little more than make the sign of the cross and mutter that people never spoke of that building. When Blake pressed him, he said very hurriedly that the Italian priests warned everybody against it, vowing that a monstrous evil had once dwelt there and left its mark. He himself had heard dark whispers of it from his father, who recalled certain sounds and rumours from his boyhood. There had been a bad sect there in the old days, an outlaw sect that called up awful things from some unknown gulf of night. It had taken a good priest to exorcise what had come, though there did be those who said that merely the light could do it. If Father O'Malley were alive, there would be many the thing he could tell. But now there was nothing to do but let it alone. It hurt nobody now, and those that owned it were dead or far away. They had run away like rats after the threatening talk in '77, when people began to mind the way folks vanished now and then in the neighbourhood. Someday the city would step in and take the property for lack of heirs, but little good would come of anybody's touching it. Better it be left alone for the years to topple, lest things be stirred that ought to rest forever in their black abyss. After the policeman had gone, Blake stood staring at the sullen, steepled pile. It excited him to find that the structure seemed as sinister to others as to him, and he wondered what grain of truth might lie behind the old tales the bluecoat had repeated. Probably they were mere legends evoked by the evil look of the place, but even so, they were like a strange coming to life of one of his own stories. The afternoon sun came out from behind dispersing clouds, but seemed unable to light up the stained, sooty walls of the old temple that towered on its high plateau. It was odd that the green of spring had not touched the brown, withered growths in the raised, iron-fenced yard. Blake found himself edging nearer the raised area and examining the bank wall and rusted fence for possible avenues of ingress. There was a terrible lure about the blackened fane which was not to be resisted. The fence had no opening near the steps, but around on the north side were some missing bars. He could go up the steps and walk around on the narrow coping outside the fence till he came to the gap. If the people feared the place so wildly, he would encounter no interference. He was on the embankment and almost inside the fence before anyone noticed him. Then, looking down, he saw the few people in the square edging away and making the same sign with their right hands that the shopkeeper in the avenue had made. Several windows were slammed down, and a fat woman darted into the street and pulled some small children inside a rickety, unpainted house. The gap in the fence was very easy to pass through, and before long, Blake found himself wading amidst the rotting, tangled growths of the deserted yard. Here and there, the worn stump of a headstone told him that there had once been burials in this field, but that, he saw, must have been very long ago. The sheer bulk of the church was oppressive now that he was close to it, but he conquered his mood and approached to try the 3 great doors in the facade. All were securely locked. so he began a circuit of the Cyclopean building in quest of some minor and more penetrable opening. Even then he could not be sure that he wished to enter that haunt of desertion and shadow. Yet the pull of its strangeness dragged him on automatically. A yawning and unprotected cellar window in the rear furnished the needed aperture. Peering in, Blake saw a subterranean gulf of cobwebs and dust faintly lit by the western sun's filtered rays. Debris, old barrels and ruined boxes and furniture of numerous sorts met his eye, though over everything lay a shroud of dust which softened all sharp outlines. The rusted remains of a hot air furnace showed that the building had been used and kept in shape as late as mid-Victorian times. Acting almost without conscious initiative, Blake crawled through the window and let himself down to the dust-carpeted and debris-strewn concrete floor. The vaulted cellar was a vast one, without partitions, and in a corner far to the right, amid dense shadows, he saw a black archway evidently leading upstairs. He felt a peculiar sense of oppression at being actually within the great spectral building, but kept it in check as he cautiously scouted about, finding a still intact barrel amid the dust and rolling it over to the open window to provide for his exit. Then, bracing himself, he crossed the wide, cobweb-festooned space toward the arch. Half choked with the omnipresent dust and covered with ghostly gossamer fibres, he reached and began to climb the worn stone steps which rose into the darkness. He had no light, but groped carefully with his hands. After a sharp turn, he felt a closed door ahead, and a little fumbling revealed its ancient latch. It opened inward, and beyond it he saw a dimly illumined corridor lined with worm-eaten panelling. Once on the ground floor, Blake began exploring in a rapid fashion. All the inner doors were unlocked, so that he freely passed from room to room. The colossal nave was an almost eldritch place with its drifts and mountains of dust over box pews, altar, hourglass pulpit, and sounding board, and its titanic ropes of cobweb stretching among the pointed arches of the gallery and entwining the clustered Gothic columns. Over all this hushed desolation played a hideous leaden light, as the declining afternoon sun sent its rays through the strange, half-blackened panes of the great apsidal windows. The paintings on those windows were so obscured by soot that Blake could scarcely decipher what they had represented, but from the little he could make out he did not like them. The designs were largely conventional, and his knowledge of obscure symbolism told him much concerning some of the ancient patterns. The few saints depicted bore expressions distinctly open to criticism, while one of the windows seemed to show merely a dark space with spirals of curious luminosity scattered about in it. Turning away from the windows, Blake noticed that the cobwebbed cross above the altar was not of the ordinary kind, but resembled the primordial Ankh or Crux Ansata of shadowy Egypt. In a rear vestry room beside the apse, Blake found a rotting desk and ceiling-high shelves of mildewed, disintegrating books. Here, for the first time, he received a positive shock of objective horror, for the titles of those books told him much. They were the black, forbidden things which most sane people have never even heard of, or have heard of only in furtive, timorous whispers. The banned and dreaded repositories of equivocal secrets and immemorial formulae, which have trickled down the stream of time from the days of man's youth, and the dim, fabulous days before man was. He had himself read many of them, a Latin version of the abhorred Necronomicon, the sinister Liber Ivonis, the infamous Culte de Gaulle of Comte de Lett, the unosprechlichen Kulten of von Junst, and old Ludwig Prinz Hellish de Vermis Mysterious. But there were others he had known merely by reputation or not at all, the Panacotic manuscripts, the Book of Xian, and a crumbling volume in wholly unidentifiable characters, yet with certain symbols and diagrams shudderingly recognizable to the occult student. Clearly the lingering local rumors had not lied. This place had once been the seat of an evil older than mankind, and wider than the known universe. In the ruined desk was a small leather-bound record book filled with entries in some odd cryptographic medium. The manuscript writing consisted of the common traditional symbols used today in astronomy and anciently in alchemy, astrology, and other dubious arts. the devices of the sun, moon, planets, aspects, and zodiacal signs, here massed in solid pages of text, with divisions and paragraphings suggesting that each symbol answered to some alphabetical letter. In the hope of later solving the cryptogram, Blake bore off this volume in his coat pocket. Many of the great tomes on the shelves fascinated him unutterably, and he felt tempted to borrow them at some later time. He wondered how they could have remained undisturbed so long. Was he the first to conquer the clutching, pervasive fear which had for nearly 60 years protected this deserted place from visitors? Having now thoroughly explored the ground floor, Blake ploughed again through the dust of the spectral nave to the front vestibule, where he had seen a door and staircase presumably leading up to the blackened tower and steeple, objects so long familiar to him at a distance. The ascent was a choking experience, for dust lay thick, while the spiders had done their worst in this constricted place. The staircase was a spiral with high, narrow wooden treads, and now and then Blake passed a clouded window looking dizzily out over the city. Though he had seen no ropes below, he expected to find a bell or peal of bells in the tower whose narrow, louver-boarded lancet windows his field glass had studied so often. Here he was doomed to disappointment, for when he attained the top of the stairs, he found the tower chamber vacant of chimes and clearly devoted to vastly different purposes. The room, about 15 feet square, was faintly lighted by 4 lancet windows, one on each side, which were glazed within their screening of decayed louver boards. These had been further fitted with tight, opaque screens, but the latter were now largely rotted away. In the centre of the dust-laden floor rose a curiously angled stone pillar, some 4 feet in height and 2 in average diameter, covered on each side with bizarre, crudely incised and wholly unrecognizable hieroglyphs. On this pillar rested a metal box of peculiarly asymmetrical form, its hinged lid thrown back, and its interior holding what looked beneath the decade-deep dust to be an egg-shaped or irregularly spherical object some 4 inches through. Around the pillar in a rough circle were 7 high-backed Gothic chairs, still largely intact, while behind them, ranging along the dark-panelled walls, were 7 colossal images of crumbling black-painted plaster, resembling more than anything else the cryptic carven megaliths of mysterious Easter Island. In one corner of the cobwebbed chamber, a ladder was built into the wall, leading up to the closed trapdoor of the windowless steeple above. As Blake grew accustomed to the feeble light, he noticed odd bas-reliefs on the strange open box of yellowish metal. Approaching, he tried to clear the dust away with his hands and handkerchief, and saw that the figurings were of a monstrous and utterly alien kind, depicting entities which, though seemingly alive, resembled no known life form ever evolved on this planet. The 4-inch seeming sphere turned out to be a nearly black, red striated polyhedron with many irregular flat surfaces, either a very remarkable crystal of some sort or an artificial object of carved and highly polished mineral matter. It did not touch the bottom of the box, but was held suspended by means of a metal band around its center, with 7 queerly designed supports extending horizontally to angles of the box's inner wall near the top. This stone, once exposed, exerted upon Blake an almost alarming fascination. He could scarcely tear his eyes from it, and as he looked at its glistening surfaces he almost fancied it was transparent, with half-formed worlds of wonder within. Into his mind floated pictures of alien orbs with great stone towers, and other orbs with Titan mountains and no mark of life, and still remoter spaces where only a stirring in vague blacknesses told of the presence of consciousness and will. When he did look away, it was to notice a somewhat singular mound of dust in the far corner near the ladder to the steeple. Just why it took his attention he could not tell, but something in its contours carried a message to his unconscious mind. Ploughing toward it, and brushing aside the hanging cobwebs as he went, he began to discern something grim about it. Hand and handkerchief soon revealed the truth, and Blake gasped with a baffling mixture of emotions. It was a human skeleton, and it must have been there for a very long time. The clothing was in shreds, but some buttons and fragments of cloth bespoke a man's grey suit. There were other bits of evidence: shoes, metal clasps, huge buttons for round cuffs, a stick pin of bygone pattern, a reporter's badge with the name of the old Providence Telegram, and a crumbling leather pocketbook. Blake examined the latter with care, finding within it several bills of antiquated issue, a celluloid advertising calendar for 1893, some cards with the name Edwin M. Lillibridge, and a paper covered with penciled memoranda. This paper held much of a puzzling nature, and Blake read it carefully at the dim westward window. Its disjointed text included such phrases as the following: Professor Enoch Bowen, home from Egypt, May 1844, buys Old Free Will Church in July. His archaeological work and studies in occult well known. Dr. Drown of Fourth Baptist warns against starry wisdom in sermon December 29th, 1844. Congregation 97 by end of 45. 1846. 3 disappearances. First mention of shining trapezohedron. 7 disappearances. 1848. Stories of blood sacrifice begin. Investigation 1853 comes to nothing. Stories of sounds. Father O'Malley tells of devil worship with box found in great Egyptian ruins. Says they call up something that can't exist in light. Flees a little light and banished by strong light. Then has to be summoned again. Probably got this from deathbed confession of Francis X. Feeney, who had joined Starry Wisdom in 49. These people say the shining trapezohedron shows them heaven and other worlds, and that the haunter of the dark tells them secrets in some way. Story of Orrin B. Eddy, 1857. They call it up by gazing at the crystal and have a secret language of their own. 200 or more in Kong, 1863. Exclusive of men at front. Irish boys mob church in 1869 after Patrick Regan's disappearance. Veiled article in J. March 14th, 72, but people don't talk about it. 6 disappearances, 1876. Secret committee calls on Mayor Doyle. Action promised February 1877. Church closes in April. Gang, Federal Hill Boys, threaten doctor, and vestrymen in May. 181 persons leave city before end of 77. Mention no names. Ghost stories begin around 1880. Try to ascertain truth of report that no human being has entered church since 1877. Ask Lanigan for photograph of place taken 1851. Restoring the paper to the pocketbook and placing the latter in his coat, Blake turned to look down at the skeleton in the dust. The implications of the notes were clear, and there could be no doubt but that this man had come to the deserted edifice 42 years before in quest of a newspaper sensation which no one else had been bold enough to attempt. Perhaps no one else had known of his plan. Who could tell? But he had never returned to his paper. Had some bravely suppressed fear risen to overcome him and bring on sudden heart failure? Blake stooped over the gleaming bones and noted their peculiar state. Some of them were badly scattered, and a few seemed oddly dissolved at the ends. Others were strangely yellowed, with vague suggestions of charring. This charring extended to some of the fragments of clothing. The skull was in a very peculiar state, stained yellow, and with a charred aperture in the top, as if some powerful acid had eaten through the solid bone. What had happened to the skeleton during its 4 decades of silent entombment here, Blake could not imagine. Before he realized it, he was looking at the stone again and letting its curious influence call up a nebulous pageantry in his mind. He saw processions of robed, hooded figures whose outlines were not human, and looked on endless leagues of desert lined with carved, sky-reaching monoliths. He saw towers and walls in nighted depths under the sea, and vortices of space where wisps of black mist floated before thin shimmerings of cold purple haze. And beyond all else he glimpsed an infinite gulf of darkness, where solid and semi-solid forms were known only by their windy stirrings, and cloudy patterns of force seemed to superimpose order on chaos, and hold forth a key to all the paradoxes and arcana of the worlds we know. Then all at once the spell was broken by an access of gnawing, indeterminate panic fear. Blake choked and turned away from the stone, conscious of some formless alien presence close to him and watching him with horrible intentness. He felt entangled with something which was not in the stone, but which had looked through it at him, something which would ceaselessly follow him with a cognition that was not physical sight. Plainly, the place was getting on his nerves, as well it might in view of his gruesome find. The light was waning too, and since he had no illuminant with him, he knew he would have to be leaving soon. It was then, in the gathering twilight, that he thought he saw a faint trace of luminosity in the crazily angled stone. He had tried to look away from it, but some obscure compulsion drew his eyes back. Was there a subtle phosphorescence of radioactivity about the thing? What was it that the dead man's notes had said concerning a shining trapezohedron? What, anyway, was this abandoned lair of cosmic evil? What had been done here, and what might still be lurking in the bird-shunned shadows? It seemed now as if an elusive touch of futur had arisen somewhere close by, though its source was not apparent. Blake seized the cover of the long open box and snapped it down. It moved easily on its alien hinges and closed completely over the unmistakably glowing stone. At the sharp click of that closing, a soft, stirring sound seemed to come from the steeple's eternal blackness overhead, beyond the trapdoor. Rats, without question, the only living things to reveal their presence in this accursed pile since he had entered it. And yet that stirring in the steeple frightened him horribly, so that he plunged almost wildly down the spiral stairs, across the ghoulish nave, into the vaulted basement, out amidst the gathering dusk of the deserted square, and down through the teeming, fear-haunted alleys and avenues of Federal Hill, toward the sane central streets and the home-like brick sidewalks of the college district. During the days which followed, Blake told no one of his expedition. Instead, he read much in certain books, examined long years of newspaper files downtown, and worked feverishly at the cryptogram in that leather volume from the cobwebbed vestry room. The cipher, he soon saw, was no simple one, and after a long period of endeavour, he felt sure that its language could not be English, Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, Italian, or German. Evidently, he would have to draw upon the deepest wells of his strange erudition. Every evening the old impulse to gaze westward returned, and he saw the black steeple as of yore amongst the bristling roofs of a distant and half-fabulous world. But now it held a fresh note of terror for him. He knew the heritage of evil lore it masked, and with the knowledge his vision ran riot in queer new ways. The birds of spring were returning, and as he watched their sunset flights, he fancied they avoided the gaunt lone spire as never before. When a flock of them approached it, he thought, they would wheel and scatter in panic confusion, and he could guess at the wild twitterings which failed to reach him across the intervening miles. It was in June that Blake's diary told of his victory over the cryptogram. The text was, he found, in the dark Aklo language used by certain cults of evil antiquity, and known to him in a halting way through previous researches. The diary is strangely reticent about what Blake deciphered, but he was patently awed and disconcerted by his results. There are references to a haunter of the dark, awaked by gazing into the shining trapezohedron, and insane conjectures about the black gulfs of chaos from which it was called. The being is spoken of as holding all knowledge and demanding monstrous sacrifices. Some of Blake's entries show fear lest the thing, which he seemed to regard as summoned, stalk abroad, though he adds that the streetlights form a bulwark which cannot be crossed. Of the shining trapezohedron he speaks often, calling it a window on all time and space, and tracing its history from the days it was fashioned on dark Yuggoth, before ever the old ones brought it to earth. It was treasured and placed in its curious box by the crinoid things of Antarctica, salvaged from their ruins by the serpent men of Volusia, and peered at eons later in Lemuria by the first human beings. It crossed strange lands and stranger seas, and sank with Atlantis before a Minoan fisher meshed it in his net and sold it to swarthy merchants from Knighted Chem. The pharaoh Nefer-en-Ka built around it a temple with a windowless crypt and did that which caused his name to be stricken from all monuments and records. Then it slept in the ruins of that evil fane which the priests and the new pharaoh destroyed, till the delver's spade once more brought it forth to curse mankind. Early in July, the newspapers oddly supplement Blake's entries, though in so brief and casual a way that only the diary has called general attention to their contribution. It appears that a new fear had been growing on Federal Hill since a stranger had entered the dreaded church. The Italians whispered of unaccustomed stirrings and bumpings and scrapings in the dark windowless steeple, and called on their priests to banish an entity which haunted their dreams. Something, they said, was constantly watching at a door to see if it were dark enough to venture forth. Press items mentioned the long-standing local superstitions, but failed to shed much light on the earlier background of the horror. It was obvious that the young reporters of today are no antiquarians. In writing of these things in his diary, Blake expresses a curious kind of remorse, and talks of the duty of burying the shining trapezohedron and of banishing what he had evoked by letting daylight into the hideous jutting spire. At the same time, however, he displays the dangerous extent of his fascination and admits a morbid longing, pervading even his dreams, to visit the accursed tower and gaze again into the cosmic secrets of the glowing stone. Then something in the journal on the morning of July 17th threw the diarist into a veritable fever of horror. It was only a variant of the other half-humorous items about the Federal Hill restlessness, but to Blake, it was somehow very terrible indeed. In the night, a thunderstorm had put the city's lighting system out of commission for a full hour, and in that black interval, the Italians had nearly gone mad with fright. Those living near the dreaded church had sworn that the thing in the steeple had taken advantage of the street lamp's absence and gone down into the body of the church, flopping and bumping around in a viscous, altogether dreadful way. Toward the last it had bumped up to the tower, where there were sounds of the shattering of glass. It could go wherever the darkness reached, but light would always send it fleeing. When the current blazed on again, there had been a shocking commotion in the tower, for even the feeble light trickling through the grime-blackened, louver-boarded windows was too much for the thing. It had bumped and slithered up into its tenebrous steeple just in time, for a long dose of light would have sent it back into the abyss whence the crazy stranger had called it. During the dark hour, praying crowds had clustered round the church in the rain with lighted candles and lamps, somehow shielded with folded paper and umbrellas. A guard of light to save the city from the nightmare that stalks in darkness. Once, those nearest the church declared, the outer door had rattled hideously. But even this was not the worst. That evening in the bulletin Blake read of what the reporters had found. Aroused at last to the whimsical news value of the scare, a pair of them had defied the frantic crowds of Italians and crawled into the church through the cellar window after trying the doors in vain. They found the dust of the vestibule and of the spectral nave ploughed up in a singular way, with bits of rotted cushions and satin pew linings scattered curiously around. There was a bad odour everywhere, and here and there were bits of yellow stain and patches of what looked like charring. Opening the door to the tower, and pausing a moment at the suspicion of a scraping sound above, they found the narrow spiral stairs wiped roughly clean. In the tower itself a similarly half-swept condition existed. They spoke of the heptagonal stone pillar, the overturned Gothic chairs, and the bizarre plaster images. Though strangely enough, the metal box and the old mutilated skeleton were not mentioned. What disturbed Blake the most, except for the hints of stains and charring and bad odours, was the final detail that explained the crashing glass. Every one of the tower's lancet windows was broken, and 2 of them had been darkened in a crude and hurried way by the stuffing of satin pew linings and cushion horsehair into the spaces between the slanting exterior louver boards. More satin fragments and bunches of horsehair lay scattered around the newly swept floor, as if someone had been interrupted in the act of restoring the tower to the absolute blackness of its tightly curtained days. Yellowish stains and charred patches were found on the ladder to the windowless spire, but when a reporter climbed up, opened the horizontally sliding trapdoor, and shot a feeble flashlight beam into the black and strangely fetid space, he saw nothing but darkness and an heterogeneous litter of shapeless fragments near the aperture. The verdict, of course, was charlatanry. Somebody had played a joke on the superstitious hill dwellers, or else some fanatic had striven to bolster up their fears for their own supposed good. Or perhaps some of the younger and more sophisticated dwellers had staged an elaborate hoax on the outside world. There was an amusing aftermath when the police sent an officer to verify the reports. 3 men in succession found ways of evading the assignment, and the 4th went very reluctantly and returned very soon without adding to the account given by the reporters. From this point onward, Blake's diary shows a mounting tide of insidious horror and nervous apprehension. He upbraids himself for not doing something and speculates wildly on the consequences of another electrical breakdown. It has been verified that on 3 occasions, during thunderstorms, he telephoned the electric light company in a frantic vein and asked that desperate precautions against a lapse of power be taken. Now and then his entries show concern over the failure of the reporters to find the metal box and stone, and the strangely marred old skeleton when they explored the shadowy tower room. He assumed that these things had been removed. Whither, and by whom or what, he could only guess. But his worst fears concerned himself, and the kind of unholy rapport he felt to exist between his mind and that lurking horror in the distant steeple, that monstrous thing of night which his rashness had called out of the ultimate black spaces. He seemed to feel a constant tugging at his will, and callers of that period remember how he would sit abstractedly at his desk and stare out of the west window at that far-off, spire-bristling mound beyond the swirling smoke of the city. His entries dwell monotonously on certain terrible dreams and of a strengthening of the unholy rapport in his sleep. There is mention of a night when he awaked to find himself fully dressed, outdoors, and headed automatically down College Hill toward the west. Again and again he dwells on the fact that the thing in the steeple knows where to find him. The week following July 30th is recalled as the time of Blake's partial breakdown. He did not dress and ordered all his food by telephone. Visitors remarked the cords he kept near his bed, and he said that sleepwalking had forced him to bind his ankles every night with knots, which would probably hold or else waken him with the labour of untying. In his diary, he told of the hideous experience which had brought the collapse. After retiring on the night of the 30th, he had suddenly found himself groping about in an almost black space. All he could see were short, faint, horizontal streaks of bluish light, but he could smell an overpowering fetor and hear a curious jumble of soft, furtive sounds above him. Whenever he moved, he stumbled over something, and at each noise there would come a sort of answering sound from above, a vague stirring, mixed with the cautious sliding of wood on wood. Once his groping hands encountered a pillar of stone with a vacant top, whilst later he found himself clutching the rungs of a ladder built into the wall and fumbling his uncertain way upward towards some region of intenser stench, where a hot, searing blast beat down against him. Before his eyes, a kaleidoscopic range of phantasmal images played, all of them dissolving at intervals into the picture of a vast, unplumbed abyss of night, wherein whirled suns and worlds of an even profounder blackness. He thought of the ancient legends of ultimate chaos, at whose centre sprawls the blind idiot god Azathoth, lord of all things, encircled by his flopping horde of mindless and amorphous dancers, and lulled by the thin, monotonous piping of a demoniac flute held in nameless paws. Then a sharp report from the outer world broke through his stupor and roused him to the unutterable horror of his position. What it was, he never knew. Perhaps it was some belated peal from the fireworks heard all summer on Federal Hill as the dwellers hail their various patron saints, or the saints of their native villages in Italy. In any event, he shrieked aloud, dropped frantically from the ladder, and stumbled blindly across the obstructed floor of the almost lightless chamber that encompassed him. He knew instantly where he was, and plunged recklessly down the narrow spiral staircase, tripping and bruising himself at every turn. There was a nightmare flight through a vast cobwebbed nave whose ghostly arches reached up to realms of leering shadow, a sightless scramble through a littered basement, a climb to regions of air and streetlights outside, and a mad racing down a spectral hill of gibbering gables, across a grim, silent city of tall black towers, and up the steep eastward precipice to his own ancient door. On regaining consciousness in the morning, he found himself lying on his study floor fully dressed. Dirt and cobwebs covered him, and every inch of his body seemed sore and bruised. When he faced the mirror, he saw that his hair was badly scorched, while a trace of strange, evil odor seemed to cling to his outer clothing. It was then that his nerves broke down. Thereafter, lounging exhaustedly about in a dressing gown, he did little but stare from his west window, shiver at the threat of thunder, and make wild entries in his diary. The great storm broke just before midnight on August 8th. Lightning struck repeatedly in all parts of the city, and 2 remarkable fireballs were reported. The rain was torrential, while a constant fusillade of thunder brought sleeplessness to thousands. Blake was utterly frantic in his fear for the lighting system and tried to telephone the company around 1 a.m., though by that time service had been temporarily cut off in the interest of safety. He recorded everything in his diary, the large, nervous, and often undecipherable hieroglyphs telling their own story of growing frenzy and despair, and of entries scrawled blindly in the dark. He had to keep the house dark in order to see out the window, and it appears that most of his time was spent at his desk, peering anxiously through the rain across the glistening miles of downtown roofs at the constellation of distant lights marking Federal Hill. Now and then he would fumblingly make an entry in his diary so that detached phrases such as, "The lights must not go," "It knows where I am," "I must destroy it," and "It is calling to me, but perhaps it means no injury this time," are found scattered down 2 of the pages. Then the lights went out all over the city. It happened at 2:12 a.m. according to Powerhouse records, but Blake's diary gives no indication of the time. The entry is merely, "Lights out, God help me." On Federal Hill there were watchers as anxious as he, and rain-soaked knots of men paraded the square and alleys around the evil church with umbrella-shaded candles, electric flashlights, oil lanterns, crucifixes, and obscure charms of the many sorts common to southern Italy. They blessed each flash of lightning and made cryptical signs of fear with their right hands when a turn in the storm caused the flashes to lessen and finally to cease altogether. A rising wind blew out most of the candles so that the scene grew threateningly dark. Someone roused Father Merluzzo of Spirito Santo Church, and he hastened to the dismal square to pronounce whatever helpful syllables he could. Of the restless and curious sounds in the blackened tower, there could be no doubt whatever. For what happened at 2:35, we have the testimony of the priest, a young, intelligent, and well-educated person, of Patrolman William J. Monaghan of the Central Station, an officer of the highest reliability who had paused at that part of his beat to inspect the crowd, and of most of the 78 men who had gathered around the church's high bank wall, especially those in the square where the eastward facade was visible. Of course, there was nothing which can be proved as being outside the order of nature. The possible causes of such an event are many. No one can speak with certainty of the obscure chemical processes arising in a vast, ancient, ill-aired and long-deserted building of heterogeneous contents. Mephitic vapors, spontaneous combustion, pressure of gases born of long decay. Any one of numberless phenomena might be responsible. And then, of course, the factor of conscious charlatanry can by no means be excluded. The thing was really quite simple in itself, and covered less than 3 minutes of actual time. Father Merluzzo, always a precise man, looked at his watch repeatedly. It started with a definite swelling of the dull, fumbling sounds inside the black tower. There had for some time been a vague exhalation of strange, evil odours from the church, and this had now become emphatic and offensive. Then at last there was a sound of splintering wood, and a large, heavy object crashed down in the yard beneath the frowning easterly facade. The tower was invisible now that the candles would not burn, but as the object neared the ground, the people knew that it was the smoke-grimed louver boarding of that tower's east window. Immediately afterward, an utterly unbearable fetor welled forth from the unseen heights, choking and sickening the trembling watchers and almost prostrating those in the square. At the same time, the air trembled with a vibration as of flapping wings, and a sudden east-blowing wind more violent than any previous blast snatched off the hats and wrenched the dripping umbrellas of the crowd. Nothing definite could be seen in the candleless night, though some upward-looking spectators thought they glimpsed a great spreading blur of denser blackness against the inky sky, something like a formless cloud of smoke that shot with meteor-like speed toward the east. That was all. The watchers were half numbed with fright, awe and discomfort, and scarcely knew what to do, or whether to do anything at all. Not knowing what had happened, they did not relax their vigil, and a moment later, they sent up a prayer as a sharp flash of belated lightning, followed by an ear-splitting crash of sound, rent the flooded heavens. Half an hour later, the rain stopped, and in 15 minutes more the streetlights sprang on again, sending the weary, bedraggled watchers relievedly back to their homes. The next day's papers gave these matters minor mention in connection with the general storm reports. It seems that the great lightning flash and deafening explosion which followed the Federal Hill occurrence were even more tremendous farther east, where a burst of the singular fetor was likewise noticed. The phenomenon was most marked over College Hill, where the crash awaked all the sleeping inhabitants and led to a bewildered round of speculations. Of those who were already awake, only a few saw the anomalous blaze of light near the top of the hill, or noticed the inexplicable upward rush of air which almost stripped the leaves from the trees and blasted the plants in the gardens. It was agreed that the lone sudden lightning bolt must have struck somewhere in this neighborhood, though no trace of its striking could afterward be found. A youth in the Tau Omega fraternity house thought he saw a grotesque and hideous mass of smoke in the air just as the preliminary flash burst, but his observation has not been verified. All of the few observers, however, agree as to the violent gust from the west and the flood of intolerable stench which preceded the belated stroke, whilst evidence concerning the momentary burned odour after the stroke is equally general. These points were discussed very carefully because of their probable connection with the death of Robert Blake. Students in the Psi Delta house, whose upper rear windows looked into Blake's study, noticed the blurred white face at the westward window on the morning of the 9th and wondered what was wrong with the expression. When they saw the same face in the same position that evening, they felt worried and watched for the lights to come up in his apartment. Later, they rang the bell of the darkened flat and finally had a policeman force the door. The rigid body sat bolt upright at the desk by the window, and when the intruders saw the glassy, bulging eyes and the marks of stark, convulsive fright on the twisted features, they turned away in sickened dismay. Shortly afterward, the coroner's physician made an examination, and despite the unbroken window, reported electrical shock, or nervous tension induced by electrical discharge, as the cause of death. The hideous expression he ignored altogether, deeming it a not improbable result of the profound shock as experienced by a person of such abnormal imagination and unbalanced emotions. He deduced these latter qualities from the books, paintings, and manuscripts found in the apartment, and from the blindly scrawled entries in the diary on the desk. Blake had prolonged his frenzied jottings to the last, and the broken pointed pencil was found clutched in his spasmodically contracted right hand. The entries after the failure of the lights were highly disjointed and legible only in part. From them, certain investigators have drawn conclusions differing greatly from the materialistic official verdict, but such speculations have little chance for belief among the conservative. The case of these imaginative theorists has not been helped by the action of superstitious Dr. Dexter, who threw the curious box and angled stone, an object certainly self-luminous as seen in the black windowless steeple where it was found, into the deepest channel of Narragansett Bay. Excessive imagination and neurotic unbalance on Blake's part, aggravated by knowledge of the evil bygone cult whose startling traces he had uncovered, formed the dominant interpretation given those final frenzied jottings. These are the entries, or all that can be made of them. Light still out. Must be 5 minutes now. Everything depends on lightning. Yadith grant it will keep up. Some influence seems beating through it. Rain and thunder and wind deafen. The thing is taking hold of my mind. Trouble with memory. I see things I never knew before. Other worlds and other galaxies. Dark. The lightning seems dark and the darkness seems light. It cannot be the real hill and church that I see in the pitch darkness. Must be retinal impression left by flashes. Heaven grant the Italians are out with their candles if the lightning stops. What am I afraid of? Is it not an avatar of Nyarlathotep, who in antique and shadowy Kem even took the form of man? I remember Yugoth, and more distant Shagai, and the ultimate void of the black planets. The long winging flight through the void cannot cross the universe of light, recreated by the thoughts caught in the shining trapezohedron. Send it through the horrible abysses of radiance. My name is Blake, Robert Harrison Blake of 620 East Knapp Street, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I am on this planet. Azathoth, have mercy. The lightning no longer flashes, horrible. I can see everything with a monstrous sense that is not sight. Light is dark and dark is light. Those people on the hill. Guard, candles and charms, they're priests. Sense of distance gone. Far is near and near is far. No light, no glass. See that steeple, that tower. Window can hear. Roderick Usher, am mad or going mad. The thing is stirring and fumbling in the tower. I am it and it is I. I want to get out. Must get out and unify the forces. It knows where I am. I am Robert Blake, but I see the tower in the dark. There is a monstrous odor. Senses transfigured. Boarding at that tower window, cracking and giving way. Aya, Ngai, ugh. I see it. Coming here. Hellwind, Titan blur. Black wings. Yog Sothoth save me. The three-lobed burning eye.
The Shadow from the Steeple by Robert Bloch. William Hurley was born an Irishman and grew up to be a taxicab driver. Therefore it would be redundant, in the face of both of these facts, to say that he was garrulous. The minute he picked up his passenger in downtown Providence that warm summer evening, he began talking. The passenger, a tall, thin man in his early 30s, entered the cab and sat back, clutching a briefcase. He gave an address on Benefit Street, and Hurley started out, shifting both taxi and tongue into high gear. Hurley began what was to be a one-sided conversation by commenting on the afternoon performance of the New York Giants. Unperturbed by his passenger's silence, he made a few remarks about the weather recent, current, and expected. Since he received no reply, the driver then proceeded to discuss a local phenomenon, namely the reported escape, that morning, of 2 black panthers or leopards from the traveling menagerie of Langer Brothers Circus, currently appearing in the city. In response to a direct inquiry as to whether he had seen the beasts roaming at large, Hurley's customer shook his head. The driver then made several uncomplimentary remarks about the local police force and their inability to capture the beasts. It was his considered opinion that a given platoon of law enforcement officers would be unable to catch a cold if immured in an icebox for a year. This witticism failed to amuse his passenger, and before Hurley could continue his monologue, they had arrived at the Benefit Street address. 85 cents changed hands, passenger and briefcase left the cab, and Hurley drove away. He could not know it at the time, but he thus became the last man who could or would testify to seeing his passenger alive. The rest is conjecture, and perhaps that is for the best. Certainly it is easy enough to draw certain conclusions as to what happened that night in the old house on Benefit Street, but the weight of those conclusions is hard to bear. One minor mystery is easy enough to clear up: the peculiar silence and aloofness of Hurley's passenger. That passenger, Edmund Fisk, of Chicago, Illinois, was meditating upon the fulfillment of 15 years of questing. The cab trip represented the last stage of this long journey, and he was reviewing the circumstances as he rode. Edmund Fisk's quest had begun on August 8, 1935, with the death of his close friend, Robert Harrison Blake, of Milwaukee. Like Fisk himself at the time, Blake had been a precocious adolescent interested in fantasy writing, and as such became a member of the Lovecraft Circle, a group of writers maintaining correspondence with one another and with the late Howard Phillips Lovecraft of Providence. It was through correspondence that Fisk and Blake had become acquainted. They visited back and forth between Milwaukee and Chicago, and their mutual preoccupation with the weird and the fantastic in literature and art served to form the foundation for the close friendship which existed at the time of Blake's unexpected and inexplicable demise. Most of the facts, and certain of the conjectures in connection with Blake's death, have been embodied in Lovecraft's story, The Haunter of the Dark, which was published more than a year after the younger writer's passing. Lovecraft had an excellent opportunity to observe matters, for it was on his suggestion that young Blake had journeyed to Providence early in 1935 and had been provided with living quarters on College Street by Lovecraft himself. So it was both as friend and neighbor that the elder fantasy writer had acted in narrating the singular story of Robert Harrison Blake's last months. In his story, he tells of Blake's efforts to begin a novel dealing with the survival of New England witch cults, but modestly omits his own part in assisting his friend to secure material. Apparently, Blake began work on his project and then became enmeshed in a horror greater than any envisioned by his imagination. For Blake was drawn to investigate the crumbling black pile on Federal Hill, the deserted ruin of a church that had once housed the worshippers of an esoteric cult. Early in spring, he paid a visit to the shunned structure, and there made certain discoveries which, in Lovecraft's opinion, made his death inevitable. Briefly, Blake entered the boarded-up Free Will Church and stumbled across the skeleton of a reporter from the Providence Telegram, one Edwin M. Lillibridge, who had apparently attempted a similar investigation in 1893. The fact that his death was not explained seemed alarming enough, but more disturbing still was the realization that no one had been bold enough to enter the church since that date and discover the body. Blake found the reporter's notebook in his clothing, and its contents afforded a partial revelation. A certain Professor Bowen, of Providence, had traveled widely in Egypt, and in 1843, in the course of archaeological investigations of the crypt of Neferenka, had made an unusual find. Neferenka is the forgotten pharaoh, whose name has been cursed by the priests and obliterated from official dynastic records. The name was familiar to the young writer at the time, due largely to the work of another Milwaukee author who had dealt with the semi-legendary ruler in his tale, Fane of the Black Pharaoh. But the discovery Bowen made in the crypt was totally unexpected. The reporter's notebook said little of the actual nature of that discovery, but it recorded subsequent events in a precise, chronological fashion. Immediately upon unearthing his mysterious find in Egypt, Professor Bowen abandoned his research and returned to Providence, where he purchased the Free Will Church in 1844 and made it the headquarters of what was called the Starry Wisdom sect. Members of this religious cult, evidently recruited by Bowen, professed to worship an entity they called the Haunter of the Dark. By gazing into a crystal, they summoned the actual presence of this entity and did homage with blood sacrifice. Such, at least, was the fantastic story circulated in Providence at the time, and the church became a place to be avoided. Local superstition fanned agitation, and agitation precipitated direct action. In May of 1877, the sect was forcibly broken up by the authorities due to public pressure, and several hundred of its members abruptly left the city. The church itself was immediately closed, and apparently individual curiosity could not overcome the widespread fear which resulted in leaving the structure undisturbed and unexplored until the reporter Lillibridge made his ill-fated private investigation in 1893. Such was the gist of the story unfolded in the pages of his notebook. Blake read it, but was nevertheless undeterred in his further scrutiny of the environs. Eventually, he came upon the mysterious object Bowen had found in the Egyptian crypt, the object upon which the starry wisdom worship had been founded, the asymmetrical metal box with its curiously hinged lid, a lid that had been closed for countless years. Blake thus gazed at the interior, gazed upon the 4-inch red-black crystal polyhedron hanging suspended by 7 supports. He not only gazed at but also into the polyhedron, just as the cult worshippers had purportedly gazed, and with the same results. He was assailed by a curious psychic disturbance. He seemed to see visions of other lands and the gulfs beyond the stars, as superstitious accounts had told. And then, Blake made his greatest mistake. He closed the box. Closing the box again, according to the superstitions annotated by Lillibridge, was the act that summoned the alien entity itself, the Haunter of the Dark. It was a creature of darkness and could not survive light, and in that boarded-up blackness of the ruined church, the thing emerged by night. Blake fled the church in terror, but the damage was done. In mid-July, a thunderstorm put out the lights in Providence for an hour, and the Italian colony living near the deserted church heard bumping and thumping from inside the shadow-shrouded structure. Crowds with candles stood outside in the rain and played candles upon the building, shielding themselves against the possible emergence of the feared entity by a barrier of light. Apparently, the story had remained alive throughout the neighborhood. Once the storm abated, local newspapers grew interested, and on the 17th of July, 2 reporters entered the old church, together with a policeman. Nothing definite was found, although there were curious and inexplicable smears and stains on the stairs and the pews. Less than a month later, at 2:35 a.m., on the morning of August 8th, to be exact, Robert Harrison Blake met his death during an electrical storm while seated before the window of his room on College Street. During the gathering storm, before his death occurred, Blake scribbled frantically in his diary, gradually revealing his innermost obsessions and delusions concerning the Haunter of the Dark. It was Blake's conviction that by gazing into the curious crystal in its box, he had somehow established a linkage with the non-terrestrial entity. He further believed that closing the box had summoned the creature to dwell in the darkness of the church steeple, and that in some way, his own fate was now irrevocably linked to that of the monstrosity. All this is revealed in the last messages he set down while watching the progress of the storm from his window. Meanwhile, at the church itself, on Federal Hill, a crowd of agitated spectators gathered to play lights upon the structure. That they heard alarming sounds from inside the boarded-up building is undeniable. At least 2 competent witnesses have testified to the fact. One, Father Maluso of the Spirito Santo Church, was on hand to quiet his congregation. The other, Patrolman, now Sergeant, William J. Monahan, of Central Station, was attempting to preserve order in the face of growing panic. Monahan himself saw the blinding blur that seemed to issue, smoke-like, from the steeple of the ancient edifice as the final lightning flash came. Flash, meteor, fireball, call it what you will, erupted over the city in a blinding blaze. Perhaps at the very moment that Robert Harrison Blake across town was writing, "Is it not an avatar of Nyarlathotep, who in antique and shadowy Kem even took the form of man?" A few moments later, he was dead. The coroner's physician rendered a verdict attributing his demise to electrical shock, although the window he faced was unbroken. Another physician, known to Lovecraft, quarreled privately with that verdict and subsequently entered the affair the next day. Without legal authority, he entered the church and climbed to the windowless steeple, where he discovered the strange asymmetrical, golden box, and the curious stone within. Apparently his first gesture was to make sure of raising the lid and bringing the stone into the light. His next recorded gesture was to charter a boat, take box and curiously angled stone aboard, and drop them into the deepest channel of Narragansett Bay. There ended the admittedly fictionalized account of Blake's death as recorded by H.P. Lovecraft, and there began Edmund Fisk's 15-year quest. Fisk, of course, had known some of the events outlined in the story. When Blake had left for Providence in the spring, Fisk had tentatively promised to join him the following autumn. At first, the two friends had exchanged letters regularly, but by early summer Blake ceased correspondence altogether. At the time, Fisk was unaware of Blake's exploration of the ruined church. He could not account for Blake's silence and wrote Lovecraft for a possible explanation. Lovecraft could supply little information. Young Blake, he said, had visited with him frequently during the early weeks of his stay, had consulted him about his writing, and had accompanied him on several nocturnal strolls through the city. But during the summer, Blake's neighborliness ceased. It was not in Lovecraft's reclusive nature to impose himself upon others, and he did not seek to invade Blake's privacy for several weeks. When he did so, and learned from the almost hysterical adolescent of his experiences in the forbidden church on Federal Hill, Lovecraft offered words of warning and advice. But it was already too late. Within 10 days of his visit came the shocking end. Fisk learned of that end from Lovecraft on the following day. It was his task to break the news to Blake's parents. For a time he was tempted to visit Providence immediately, but lack of funds and the pressure of his own domestic affairs forestalled him. The body of his young friend duly arrived, and Fisk attended the brief ceremony of cremation. Then Lovecraft began his own investigation, an investigation which ultimately resulted in the publication of his story. And there, the matter might have rested, but Fisk was not satisfied. His best friend had died under circumstances which even the most skeptical must admit were mysterious. The local authorities summarily wrote off the matter with a fatuous and inadequate explanation. Fisk determined to ascertain the truth. Bear in mind one salient fact. All three of these men, Lovecraft, Blake, and Fisk, were professional writers and students of the supernatural or the supranormal. All three of them had extraordinary access to a bulk of written material dealing with ancient legend and superstition. Ironically enough, the use to which they put their knowledge was limited to excursions into so-called fantasy fiction, but none of them, in the light of their own experience, could wholly join their reading audience in scoffing at the myths of which they wrote. For, as Fisk wrote to Lovecraft, the term myth, as we know, is merely a polite euphemism. Blake's death was not a myth, but a hideous reality. I implore you to investigate fully. See this matter through to the end, for if Blake's diary holds even a distorted truth, there is no telling what may be loosed upon the world. Lovecraft pledged cooperation, discovered the fate of the metal box and its contents, and endeavored to arrange a meeting with Dr. Ambrose Dexter of Benefit Street. Dr. Dexter, it appeared, had left town immediately following his dramatic theft and disposal of the shining trapezohedron, as Lovecraft called it. Lovecraft then apparently interviewed Father Maluzzo and Patrolman Monahan, plunged into the files of the Bulletin, and endeavored to reconstruct the story of the Starry Wisdom sect and the entity they worshipped. Of course, he learned a good deal more than he dared to put into his magazine story. His letters to Edmund Fisk in the late fall and early spring of 1936 contained guarded hints and references to menaces from outside. But he seemed anxious to reassure Fisk that if there had been any menace, even in the realistic rather than the supernatural sense, the danger was now averted because Dr. Dexter had disposed of the shining trapezohedron, which acted as a summoning talisman. Such was the gist of his report, and the matter rested there for a time. Fisk made tentative arrangements, early in 1937, to visit Lovecraft at his home, with the private intention of doing some further research on his own into the cause of Blake's death. But once again, circumstances intervened. For in March of that year, Lovecraft died. His unexpected passing plunged Fisk into a period of mental despondency from which he was slow to recover. Accordingly, it was not until almost a year later that Edmund Fisk paid his first visit to Providence and to the scene of the tragic episodes which brought Blake's life to a close. For somehow, always, a black undercurrent of suspicion existed. The coroner's physician had been glib, Lovecraft had been tactful, the press and the general public had accepted matters completely, yet Blake was dead, and there had been an entity abroad in the night. Fisk felt that if he could visit the accursed church himself, talk to Dr. Dexter, and find out what had drawn him into the affair, interrogate the reporters, and pursue any relevant leads or clues, he might eventually hope to uncover the truth and at least clear his dead friend's name of the ugly shadow of mental unbalance. Accordingly, Fisk's first step after arriving in Providence and registering at a hotel was to set out for Federal Hill and the ruined church. The search was doomed to immediate, irremediable disappointment. For the church was no more. It had been razed the previous fall and the property taken over by the city authorities. The black and baleful spire no longer cast its spell over the hill. Fisk immediately took pains to see Father Maluzzo at Spirito Santo, a few squares away. He learned from a courteous housekeeper that Father Maluzzo had died in 1936, within a year of young Blake. Discouraged but persistent, Fisk next attempted to reach Dr. Dexter, but the old house on Benefit Street was boarded up. A call to the Physician Service Bureau produced only the cryptic information that Ambrose Dexter had left the city for an indeterminate stay. Nor did a visit with the city editor of the Bulletin yield any better result. Fisk was permitted to go into the newspaper's morgue and read the aggravatingly short and matter-of-fact story on Blake's death, but the two reporters who had covered the assignment and subsequently visited the Federal Hill Church had left the paper for berths in other cities. There were, of course, other leads to follow, and during the ensuing week, Fisk ran them all to the ground. A copy of Who's Who added nothing significant to his mental picture of Dr. Ambrose Dexter. The physician was Providence-born, a lifelong resident, 40 years of age, unmarried, a general practitioner, member of several medical societies, but there was no indication of any unusual hobbies or other interests which might provide a clue as to his participation in the affair. Sergeant William J. Monahan of Central Station was sought out, and for the first time Fisk actually managed to speak to someone who admitted an actual connection with the events leading to Blake's death. Monahan was polite, but cautiously non-committal. Despite Fisk's complete unburdening, the police officer remained discreetly reticent.
There's really nothing I can tell you. It's true, like Mr. Lovecraft said, that I was at the church that night, for there was a rough crowd out, and there's no telling what some of them ones in the neighborhood will do when riled up. Like the story said, the old church had a bad name, and I guess Sheely could have given you many's the story.
Sheely? Interjected Fisk.
Bert Sheely. It was his beat, you know, not mine. He was ill of pneumonia at the time, and I substituted for 2 weeks. Then, when he died...
Fisk shook his head. Another possible source of information gone. Blake dead, Lovecraft dead, Father Maluzzo dead, and now Sheely. Reporters scattered, and Dr. Dexter mysteriously missing. He sighed and persevered. That last night when you saw the blur, he asked, can you add anything by way of details? Were there any noises? Did anyone in the crowd say anything? Try to remember. Whatever you can add may be of great help to me. Monahan shook his head.
There were noises aplenty. But what with the thunder and all, I couldn't rightly make out if anything came from inside the church, like the story has it. And as for the crowd, with the women wailing and the men muttering, all mixed up with thunderclaps and wind, it was as much as I could do to hear myself yelling to keep in place, let alone make out what was being said.
And the blur? Fisk persisted.
It was a blur. And that's all. Smoke, or a cloud, or just a shadow before the lightning struck again. But I'll not be saying I saw any devils or monsters or whatchamacallits as Mr. Lovecraft would write about in those wild tales of his.
Sergeant Monahan shrugged self-righteously and picked up the desk phone to answer a call. The interview was obviously at an end, and so, for the nonce, was Fisk's quest. He didn't abandon hope, however. For a day he sat by his own hotel phone and called up every Dexter listed in the book in an effort to locate a relative of the missing doctor, but to no avail. Another day was spent in a small boat on Narragansett Bay as Fisk assiduously and painstakingly familiarized himself with the location of the deepest channel alluded to in Lovecraft's story. But at the end of a futile week in Providence, Fisk had to confess himself beaten. he returned to Chicago, his work, and his normal pursuits. Gradually, the affair dropped out of the foreground of his consciousness, but he by no means forgot it completely, or gave up the notion of eventually unraveling the mystery, if mystery there was. In 1941, during a 3-day furlough from basic training, PVT, First Class Edmund Fisk passed through Providence on his way to New York City and again attempted to locate Dr. Ambrose Dexter without success. During 1942 and 1943, Sergeant Edmund Fisk wrote, from his stations overseas, to Dr. Ambrose Dexter, care of General Delivery, Providence, Rhode Island. His letters were never acknowledged, if indeed they were received. In 1945, in a USO library lounge in Honolulu, Fisk read a report in, of all things, a journal on astrophysics, which mentioned a recent gathering at Princeton University, at which the guest speaker, Dr. Ambrose Dexter, had delivered an address on practical applications in military technology. Fisk did not return to the States until the end of 1946. Domestic affairs, naturally, were the subject of his paramount consideration during the following year. It wasn't until 1948 that he accidentally came upon Dr. Dexter's name again, this time in a listing of investigators in the field of nuclear physics in a national weekly news magazine. He wrote the editors for further information, but received no reply, and another letter, dispatched to Providence, remained unanswered. But in 1949, late in autumn, Dexter's name again came to his attention through the news columns, this time in relation to a discussion of work on the secret H-bomb. Whatever he guessed, whatever he feared, whatever he wildly imagined, Fisk was impelled to action. It was then that he wrote to a certain Ogden Purvis, a private investigator in the city of Providence, and commissioned him to locate Dr. Ambrose Dexter. All that he required was that he be placed in communication with Dexter, and he paid a substantial retainer fee. Purvis took the case. The private detective sent several reports to Fisk in Chicago, and they were, at first, disheartening. The Dexter residence was still untenanted. Dexter himself, according to the information elicited from governmental sources, was on a special mission. The private investigator seemed to assume from this that he was a person above reproach, engaged in confidential defense work. Fisk's own reaction was panic. He raised his offer of a fee and insisted that Ogden Purvis continue his efforts to find the elusive doctor. Winter of 1950 came, and with it, another report. The private investigator had tracked down every lead Fisk suggested, and one of them led, eventually, to Tom Jonas. Tom Jonas was the owner of the small boat which had been chartered by Dr. Dexter one evening in the late summer of 1935. The small boat which had been rowed to the deepest channel of Narragansett Bay. Tom Jonas had rested his oars as Dexter threw overboard the dully gleaming asymmetrical metal box with the hinged lid open to disclose the shining trapezohedron. The old fisherman had spoken freely to the private detective. His words were reported in detail to Fisk via confidential report.
Mighty peculiar,
was Jonas's own reaction to the incident. Dexter had offered him
20 smackers to take the boat out in the middle of midnight and heave this funny-looking contraption overboard. Said there was no harm in it. Said it was just an old keepsake he wanted to get rid of. But all the way out he kept staring at the sort of jewel thing set in some iron bands inside the box, and mumbling in some foreign language, I guess. No, 'tweren't French or German or Italian talk either. Polish, maybe. I don't remember any words either, but he acted sort of drunk. Not that I'd say anything against Dr. Dexter, understand. Comes of a fine old family, even if he ain't been around these parts since, to my knowing. But I figured he was a bit under the influence, you might say. Else why would he pay me 20 smackers to do a crazy stunt like that?
There was more to the verbatim transcript of the old fisherman's monologue, but it did not explain anything.
He sure seemed glad to get rid of it, as I recollect. On the way back, he told me to keep mum about it, but I can't see no harm in telling at this late date. I wouldn't hold anything back from the law.
Evidently, the private investigator had made use of a rather unethical stratagem, posing as an actual detective in order to get Jonas to talk. This did not bother Fisk in Chicago. It was enough to get his grasp on something tangible at last. Enough to make him send Purvis another payment, with instructions to keep up the search for Ambrose Dexter. Several months passed in waiting. Then, in late spring, came the news Fisk had waited for. Dr. Dexter was back. He had returned to his house on Benefit Street. The boards had been removed, furniture vans arrived to discharge their contents, and a manservant appeared to answer the door and to take telephone messages. Dr. Dexter was not at home to the investigator or to anyone. He was, it appeared, recuperating from a severe illness contracted while in government service. He took a card from Purvis and promised to deliver a message, but repeated calls brought no indication of a reply. Nor did Purvis, who conscientiously cased the house and neighborhood, ever succeed in laying eyes upon the doctor himself, or in finding anyone who claimed to have seen the convalescent physician on the street. Groceries were delivered regularly. Mail appeared in the box. Lights glowed in the Benefit Street house nightly until all hours. As a matter of fact, this was the only concrete statement Purvis could make regarding any possible irregularity in Dr. Dexter's mode of life. He seemed to keep electricity burning 24 hours a day. Fisk promptly dispatched another letter to Dr. Dexter, and then another. Still no acknowledgement or reply was forthcoming. And after several more unenlightening reports from Purvis, Fisk made up his mind. He would go to Providence and see Dexter, somehow, come what may. He might be completely wrong in his suspicions. He might be completely wrong in his assumption that Dr. Dexter could clear the name of his dead friend. He might be completely wrong in even surmising any connection between the two. But for 15 years, he had brooded and wondered, and it was time to put an end to his own inner conflict. Accordingly, late that summer, Fisk wired Purvis of his intentions and instructed him to meet him at the hotel upon his arrival. Thus it was that Edmund Fisk came to Providence for the last time, on the day that the Giants lost, on the day that the Langer brothers lost their 2 Black Panthers, on the day that cab driver William Hurley was in a garrulous mood. Purvis was not at the hotel to meet him, but such was Fisk's own frenzy of impatience that he decided to act without him, and drove, as we have seen, to Benefit Street in the early evening. As the cab departed, Fisk stared up at the panelled doorway, stared at the lights blazing from the upper windows of the Georgian structure. A brass nameplate gleamed on the door itself, and the light from the windows played upon the legend, Ambrose Dexter Slight as it was. This seemed a reassuring touch to Edmund Fisk. The doctor was not concealing his presence in the house from the world, however much he might conceal his actual person. Surely the blazing lights and the appearance of the nameplate augured well. Fisk shrugged, rang the bell. The door opened quickly. A small, dark-skinned man with a slight stoop appeared and made a question of the word.
Yes?
Dr. Dexter, please.
The doctor is not into callers. He is ill.
Would you take a message, please? Tell him that Edmund Fisk of Chicago wishes to see him at his convenience for a few moments. I have come all the way from the Middle West for this purpose, and what I have to speak to him about would take only a moment or two of his time.
Wait, please.
The door closed. Fisk stood in the gathering darkness and transferred his briefcase from one hand to the other. Abruptly, the door opened again. The servant peered out at him.
Mr. Fisk, are you the gentleman who wrote the letters?
Letters? Oh, yes, I am. I did not know the doctor ever received them.
I could not say. But Dr. Dexter said that if you were the man who had written him, you were to come right in.
Fisk permitted himself an audible sigh of relief as he stepped over the threshold. It had taken 15 years to come this far, and now...
Just go upstairs, if you please. You will find Dr. Dexter waiting in the study right at the head of the hall.
Edmund Fisk climbed the stairs, turned at the top to a doorway, and entered a room in which the light was an almost palpable presence, so intense was its glare. And there, rising from a chair beside the fireplace, was Dr. Ambrose Dexter. Fisk found himself facing a tall, thin, immaculately dressed man who may have been 50, but who scarcely looked 35. A man whose wholly natural grace and elegance of movement concealed the sole incongruity of his aspect, a very deep suntan.
So you are Edmund Fisk?
The voice was soft, well modulated, and unmistakably New England, and the accompanying handclasp warm and firm. Dr. Dexter's smile was natural and friendly. White teeth gleamed against the brown background of his features.
"Won't you sit down?"
Invited the doctor. He indicated a chair and bowed slightly. Fisk couldn't help but stare. There was certainly no indication of any present or recent illness in his host's demeanor or behavior. As Dr. Dexter resumed his own seat near the fire and Fisk moved around the chair to join him, he noted the bookshelves on either side of the room. The size and shape of several volumes immediately engaged his rapt attention, so much that he hesitated before taking a seat and instead inspected the titles of the tomes. For the first time in his life, Edmund Fisk found himself confronting the half-legendary De Vermis Mysteriis, the Liber Ivonis, and the almost mythical Latin version of the Necronomicon. Without seeking his host's permission, he lifted the bulk of the latter volume from the shelf and riffled through the yellowed pages of the Spanish translation of 1622. Then he turned to Dr. Dexter, and all traces of his carefully contrived composure dropped away. "Then it must have been you who found these books in the church," he said. "In the rear vestry room beside the apse, Lovecraft mentioned them in his story, and I've always wondered what became of them." Dr. Dexter nodded gravely.
"Yes, I took them. I did not think it wise for such books to fall into the hands of the authorities. You know what they contain, and what might happen if such knowledge were wrongfully employed."
Fisk reluctantly replaced the great book on the shelf and took a chair facing the doctor before the fire. He held his briefcase on his lap and fumbled uneasily with the clasp.
"Don't be uneasy. Let us proceed without fencing. You are here to discover what part I played in the affair of your friend's death."
"Yes, there are some questions I wanted to ask."
"Please. I am not in the best of health and can give you only a few minutes. Allow me to anticipate your queries and tell you what little I know."
"As you wish." Fisk stared at the bronze man, wondering what lay behind the perfection of his poise.
"I met your friend Robert Harrison Blake only once. It was on an evening during the latter part of July 1935. He called upon me here as a patient."
Fisk leaned forward eagerly. "I never knew that," he exclaimed.
There was no reason for anyone to know it. He was merely a patient. He claimed to be suffering from insomnia. I examined him, prescribed a sedative, and acting on the merest surmise, asked if he had recently been subjected to any unusual strain or trauma. It was then that he told me the story of his visit to the church on Federal Hill and of what he had found there. I must say that I had the acumen not to dismiss his tale as the product of a hysterical imagination. As a member of one of the older families here, I was already acquainted with the legends surrounding the Starry Wisdom sect and the so-called Haunter of the Dark. Young Blake confessed to me certain of his fears concerning the shining trapezohedron, intimating that it was a focal point of primal evil. He further admitted his own dread of being somehow linked to the monstrosity in the church. Naturally, I was not prepared to accept this last premise as a rational one. I attempted to reassure the young man, advised him to leave Providence and forget it, and at the time I acted in all good faith. And then in August came news of Blake's death.
"So you went to the church?" Fisk said.
"Wouldn't you have done the same thing? If Blake had come to you with this story, told you of what he feared, wouldn't his death have moved you to action? I assure you, I did what I thought best. Rather than provoke a scandal, rather than expose the general public to needless fears, rather than permit the possibility of danger to exist, I went to the church. I took the books. I took the shining trapezohedron from under the noses of the authorities. And I chartered a boat and dumped the accursed thing in Narragansett Bay, where it could no longer possibly harm mankind. The lid was up when I dropped it. For as you know, only darkness can summon the haunter, and now the stone is eternally exposed to light. But that is all I can tell you. I regret that my work in recent years has prevented me from seeing or communicating with you before this. I appreciate your interest in the affair, and trust my remarks will help to clarify, in a small way, your bewilderment. As to young Blake, in my capacity as examining physician, I will gladly give you a written testimony to my belief in his sanity at the time of his death. I'll have it drawn up tomorrow and send it to your hotel if you give me the address. Fair enough.
The doctor rose, signifying that the interview was over. Fisk remained seated, shifting his briefcase.
Now, if you will excuse me.
In a moment. There are still one or two brief questions I'd appreciate your answering.
Certainly.
If Dr. Dexter was irritated, he gave no sign. Did you by any chance see Lovecraft before or during his last illness?
No, I was not his physician. In fact, I never met the man, though of course I knew of him and his work.
What caused you to leave Providence so abruptly after the Blake affair?
My interests in physics superseded my interest in medicine. As you may or may not know, during the past decade or more, I have been working on problems relative to atomic energy and nuclear fission. In fact, starting tomorrow, I am leaving Providence once more to deliver a course of lectures before the faculties of Eastern universities and certain governmental groups.
That is very interesting to me, Doctor, said Fisk. By the way, did you ever meet Einstein?
As a matter of fact, I did some years ago. I worked with him on but no matter. I must beg you to excuse me now. At another time, perhaps, we can discuss such things.
His impatience was unmistakable now. Fisk rose, lifting his briefcase in one hand and reaching out to extinguish a table lamp with the other. Dr. Dexter crossed swiftly and lighted the lamp again. "Why are you afraid of the dark, Doctor?" asked Fisk softly.
I am not afraid.
For the first time, the physician seemed on the verge of losing his composure.
What makes you think that?
He whispered. "It's the shining trapezohedron, isn't it?" Fisk continued. "When you threw it into the bay, you acted too hastily. You didn't remember at the time that even if you left the lid open, the stone would be surrounded by darkness there at the bottom of the channel. Perhaps the Haunter didn't want you to remember. You looked into the stone just as Blake did, and established the same psychic linkage. And when you threw the thing away, you gave it into perpetual darkness, where the Haunter's power would feed and grow. That's why you left Providence, because you were afraid the Haunter would come to you, just as it came to Blake, and because you knew that now the thing would remain abroad forever." Dr. Dexter moved toward the door.
I must definitely ask that you leave now. If you're implying that I keep the lights on because I'm afraid of the Haunter coming after me, the way it did Blake, then you're mistaken.
Fisk smiled wryly. "That's not it at all," he answered. "I know you don't fear that, because it's too late. The Haunter must have come to you long before this, perhaps within a day or so after you gave it power by consigning the trapezohedron to the darkness of the bay. It came to you, but unlike the case of Blake, it did not kill you. It used you. That's why you fear the dark. You fear it as the Haunter itself fears being discovered. I believe that in the darkness you look different, more like the old shape. Because when the Haunter came to you, it did not kill but instead merged. You are the Haunter of the dark."
Mr. Fisk, really?
There is no Dr. Dexter. There hasn't been any such person for many years now. There's only the outer shell, possessed by an entity older than the world, an entity that is moving quickly and cunningly to bring destruction to all mankind. It was you who turned scientist and insinuated yourself into the proper circles, hinting and prompting and assisting foolish men into their sudden discovery of nuclear fission. When the first atomic bomb fell, how you must have laughed. And now you've given them the secret of the hydrogen bomb, and you're going on to teach them more, show them new ways to bring about their own destruction. It took me years of brooding to discover the clues, the keys to the so-called wild myths that Lovecraft wrote about. For he wrote in parable and allegory, but he wrote the truth. He has set it down in black and white time and again, the prophecy of your coming to Earth. Blake knew it at the last when he identified the Haunter by its rightful name.
And that is?
Snapped the doctor. Nyarlathotep. The brown face creased into a grimace of laughter.
I'm afraid you're a victim of the same fantasy projections as poor Blake and your friend Lovecraft. Everyone knows that Nyarlathotep is pure invention part of the Lovecraft mythos.
I thought so, until I found the clue in his poem. That's when it all fitted in. The haunter of the dark, your fleeing, and your sudden interest in scientific research. Lovecraft's words took on a new meaning. And at the last from inner Egypt came the strange dark one to whom the fellows bowed. Fisk chanted the lines, staring at the dark face of the physician.
Nonsense. If you must know, this dermatological disturbance of mine is the result of exposure to radiation at Los Alamos.
Fisk did not heed. He was continuing Lovecraft's poem, that wild beasts followed him and licked his hands. Soon from the sea a noxious birth began. Forgotten lands with weedy spires of gold, the ground was cleft, and mad auroras rolled down on the quaking citadels of man. Then, crushing what he chanced to mold in play, the idiot chaos blew Earth's dust away. Dr. Dexter shook his head.
Ridiculous on the face of it. Surely, even in your, upset condition, you can understand that, man. The poem has no literal meaning. Do wild beasts lick my hands? Is something rising from the sea? Are there earthquakes and auroras? Nonsense. You're suffering from a bad case of what we call atomic jitters. I can see it now. You're preoccupied, as so many laymen are today, with the foolish obsession that somehow our work in nuclear fission will result in the destruction of the Earth. All this rationalization is a product of your imaginings.
Fisk held his briefcase tightly. I told you it was a parable. This prophecy of Lovecraft's. God knows what he knew or feared. Whatever it was enough to make him cloak his meaning. And even then, perhaps, they got to him because he knew too much.
They?
They from outside the ones you serve. You are their messenger, Nyarlathotep. You came in linkage with the shining trapezohedron, out of inner Egypt, as the poem says, and the fellas, the common workers of Providence, who became converted to the starry wisdom sect, bowed before the strange dark one they worshipped as the haunter. The trapezohedron was thrown into the bay, and soon from the sea came this noxious birth your birth, or incarnation, in the body of Dr. Dexter. And you taught men new methods of destruction with atomic bombs in which the ground was cleft, and mad auroras rolled down on the quaking citadels of man. Oh, Lovecraft knew what he was writing, and Blake recognized you too, and they both died. I suppose you'll try to kill me now so you can go on. You'll lecture, and stand at the elbows of the laboratory men, urging them on, and giving them new suggestions to result in greater destruction. And finally you'll blow Earth's dust away.
Please, control yourself. Let me get you something. Can't you realize this whole thing is absurd?
Fisk moved toward him, hands fumbling at the clasp of the briefcase. The flap opened, and Fisk reached inside, then withdrew his hand. He held a revolver now, and he pointed it quite steadily at Dr. Dexter's breast. Of course it's absurd, Fisk muttered. No one ever believed in the starry wisdom sect, except a few fanatics and some ignorant people. No one ever took Blake's stories or Lovecraft's, or mine for that matter, as anything but a rather morbid form of amusement. By the same token, no one will ever believe there is anything wrong with you, and with so-called scientific investigation of atomic energy, or the other horrors you plan to loose on the world to bring about its doom. And that's why I'm going to kill you now.
Put down that gun.
Fisk began suddenly to tremble. His whole body shook in a spectacular spasm. Dexter noted it and moved forward. The younger man's eyes were bulging, and the physician inched toward him. "Stand back!" Fisk warned. The words were distorted by the convulsive shuddering of his jaws. "That's all I needed to know. Since you are in a human body, you can be destroyed by ordinary weapons. As so I do destroy you, Nyarlathotep." His finger moved. So did Dr. Dexter's. His hand went swiftly behind him, to the master light switch on the wall. A click, and the room was plunged into utter darkness. Not utter darkness, for there was a glow. The face and hands of Dr. Ambrose Dexter glowed with a phosphorescent fire in the dark. There are presumable forms of radium poisoning which can cause such an effect, and no doubt Dr. Dexter would have so explained the phenomenon to Edmund Fisk, had he the opportunity. but there was no opportunity. Edmund Fisk heard the click, saw the fantastic flaming features, and pitched forward to the floor. Dr. Dexter quietly switched on the lights, went over to the younger man's side, and knelt for a long moment. He sought a pulse in vain. Edmund Fisk was dead. The doctor sighed, rose, and left the room. In the hall downstairs, he summoned his servant.
There has been a regrettable accident. That young visitor of mine, a hysteric, suffered a heart attack. You had better call the police immediately, and then continue with the packing. We must leave tomorrow for the lecture tour.
But the police may detain you.
Dr. Dexter shook his head.
I think not. It's a clear-cut case. In any event, I can easily explain. When they arrive, notify me. I shall be in the garden.
The doctor proceeded down the hall to the rear exit and emerged upon the moonlit splendor of the garden behind the house on Benefit Street. The radiant vista was walled off from the world, utterly deserted. The dark man stood in moonlight, and its glow mingled with his own aura. At this moment, two silken shadows leapt over the wall. They crouched in the coolness of the garden, then slithered forward toward Dr. Dexter. They made panting sounds. In the moonlight, he recognized the shapes of two black panthers. Immobile, he waited as they advanced, padding purposefully toward him, eyes aglow, jaws slavering and agape. Dr. Dexter turned away. His face was turned in mockery to the moon as the beasts fawned before him and licked his hands.